What's going on, Guardians? It's Tizzle here, and in this video, I want to showcase with you my new favorite build to run in Destiny 2. I've honestly not been able to stop playing with this setup. It's actually a problem. It's just too fun and too strong. I've taken it through expert onslaught runs, solo master nightfalls, and lost sectors, and I'll be rocking it in solo GMs when they release. This build can truly do it all, and I'm not even exaggerating either. One throw of your shuriken melee with this build can stun any champion type, which is really nice because for anti-champion weaponry, I find the artifact this season to be pretty weak. But no need to fear because this build has you covered. This build also has insanely high uptime on your transcendence, which enhances the build even further because it's based around throwing our melees as much as possible. So let's take a closer look at it. It all centers around the new stasis exotic Mask of Fealty. It has the exotic trait Null Factor, which states Withering Blade hits and bounces create a small stasis crystal and refund a portion of melee energy. Using Withering Blades to shatter crystals or frozen targets releases a spread of Withering Blades. So right now this is actually bugged and doesn't always make the spread of Withering Blades. But this just means that when Bungie fixes it, this build will be even better. The Destiny Data Compendium states each hit or bounce grants 7.5% melee energy. For aspects, we are running Gunpowder Gamble, so when we defeat enemies with abilities, we get a Gunpowder Gamble which can ignite enemies. This is extremely powerful and gives us awesome ad clear and even good supplemental damage for champions, and it can stun unstoppables. And then we have Stylus Executioner. This will make us go invisible when we kill an enemy affected by any elemental debuff, and with this build, everything is basically frozen or slowed, so we'll be proccing this constantly. This aspect is optional if you want to run something else, but for high-end content like I like to run, this is extremely beneficial and allows us to play very aggressively with this build. Speaking of playing aggressively, I like to run the Fragment Facet of Protection, which gives us 15% damage resistance when we're surrounded by 3 or more enemies, and it also gives us plus 10 to strength. The most important fragment is Facet of Ruin, which increases the size and damage of the burst when you shatter a stasis crystal or frozen target, and it increases the area of effect of our ignitions. So we are double dipping with this fragment because this build makes a ton of crystals and it makes ignitions with our Gunpowder Gambles, and it also gives us plus 10 mobility. Next is Facet of Dawn, which allows us to become radiant for 5 seconds when we deal damage with our melee. This is what allows us to deal with barrier champions because our weapons will be anti-barrier when we have radiant procced. This does give us minus 10 to strength, but it's well worth it for the damage boost and anti-barrier capabilities, and we chuck so many melees that this is up quite a bit. So this next one is optional. Originally I had Facet of Blessing, which helps with survivability. Melee final blows start health regeneration, and when transcendent it procs health regen for you and nearby allies. Because we're using so many melees, it will proc every now and then and help you stay alive. It does have to be the melee that gets the kill though, and not a shatter, and it even works with regular melees. However, I took it off for a much better fragment, Facet of Awakening. Rapidly defeating targets with light or darkness damage or super final blows generates an elemental pickup of the matching damage type, gives plus 10 to resilience. So what is so awesome about this is we make a ton of stasis shards and we get melee energy back when we pick up these shards. But we can also make fire sprites which give grenade energy, void breaches which give class ability energy, and ionic traces which give grenade, melee, and class ability. All we need is multi-kills. The elemental pickup we'll be making the most is stasis shards, and then fire sprites with our Gunpowder Gamble, but depending on your loadout, you could make void breaches and ionic traces with your weapons quite easily, and this just all feeds back into our abilities, so the ability uptime is insanely high, and when we get to the artifact mods, it cranks it up even further. So first we have one more fragment to look at, and that is Facet of Devotion. This one is very important. Defeating targets afflicted by stasis or strand debuffs grants bonus light transcendence energy, plus 10 to strength. This setup builds darkness transcendence super quickly because it is very stasis based. So having this will help you have transcendence up a lot more, which is very beneficial to any build, but especially this one because we have enhanced melees from our exotic. So for the rest of the abilities, we are obviously running Withering Blade, and then we have a Duskveil Grenade to slow and freeze even more enemies, and then Gambler's Dodge so that we can dodge near enemies to get our melee back for even more melee uptime. And you can do this even in hard content thanks to being able to go invis with Stylus Execution, and the damage resistance from Facet of Protection helps a lot as well. And for the super, this will depend on the surges for the week, but I really like to run it with Tether. So now let's look at the artifact mods, because even on its own this build is cracked, but we have some artifact mods that make it even better. The most important one in my opinion is Hail the Storm. This releases shards of ice that damage and slow targets, and then when we upgrade it with a tonic, our shatters will deal increased damage. And with the other one that we can upgrade with the refined tonic of stasis crystallization is crystalline converter. When upgraded, our stasis weapon final blows will spawn a stasis shard after using our class ability. This one is pretty weak and loadout dependent, but the base version of crystalline converter is excellent. It states gather stasis shards to gain stacks of crystalline converter. Your next powered stasis melee hit creates stasis crystals equal to the number of stacks you have. So essentially, this just allows us to make even more stasis crystals, which will result in even bigger shatters and more damage thanks to Hail the Storm. Served Cold allows Void Breaches to grant us melee energy and stasis shards to grant class ability. This is extremely strong thanks to Facet of Awakening. We also have Brain Freeze, where frozen combatants become surrounded by chilling fog, which slows combatants who aren't already. This just allows us to slow even more enemies, but it's basically overkill. It's still worth running if you have nothing better to run, but if you're running a Void weapon, then Supernova may be even better. Picking up a Void Breach causes your next source of Void damage to create a large weakening pulse. This pairs great with the Area Denial GL from the dungeon vs Velocity Baton. And then if you run this, you could also go with Power from Pain, where rapid final blows against weakened combatants grant you Devour. This gives the build even more survivability, but again, it's loadout dependent. But the main ones are Hail the Storm, Crystalline Converter, and Served Cold. The rest will just depend on the loadout that you're running. And speaking of loadouts, I love running this with the VS Velocity Baton. My role has Repulsor Brace destabilizing rounds, which is really nice because I can proc Invis for Stylus Executioner with destabilizing rounds, and then get an Overshield for even more damage resistance. It can also weaken champions and bosses and stuff thanks to Concussive Reload, and we have Overload Breach Grenade Launcher to lower combatant damage output. And if we proc Supernova, then it can weaken any enemy. But the real power with this weapon lies in its ability to generate transcendence energy. It's a transcendence machine. So we can use it to deal damage over time to multiple enemies, and then chuck out a melee to freeze and kill everything, giving us huge chunks of transcendence. Aside from that, you can run basically whatever you like for weapons. Like I said, overloads and unstops are handled easily with our abilities, so go nuts on the weapons front. I've paired this with Huckleberry in Revision 0 and it works amazingly. And I have also had a lot of fun using it with Salvation's Grip for even more area denial capability. You just freeze everything, then chuck a melee to destroy all the crystals. It works really well. As for stats, 100 resilience is a must, and then I like to run high discipline and around 60 strength. I then run Font of Vigor on my gloves for 30 more stats to the strength when I have an Orb of Power. This makes our passive melee cooldown very quick. You could run heavy-handed here if you like as well, but I find we get way more shatter kills than melee final blows, but you do you. I like to run a loader mod, usually Void for my GL, and then Impact Induction for grenade energy back when we deal damage with our melee. You could also go Momentum Transfer for melee energy back when you deal damage with your grenade to further feed into your melees, but I find I'm never really hurting for melee energy. The big reason is because if you run out of melees, you usually have Transcendence, which can then give you melees like crazy, and you can build up Transcendence super quickly. On the helmet, I usually just have Siphon mods that match my weapons. On the chest piece, I use resistances that match the activity. Leg mods, I go with Recuperation for a chunk of health when I pick up an orb, Innervation for a bit of grenade energy when I grab an orb, and Absolution for energy to all my ability cooldowns when I get an orb. On the class item, Reaper is great. We are often dodging near enemies for our melee back, so when we get a weapon kill, this will make an Orb of Power. Distribution for ability energy back when dodging near enemies, and Bomber for a chunk of grenade energy whenever we dodge. You could go with Outreach on the cloak and Invigoration on the legs for even more melee energy, but I truly feel it's not needed. I've used this build a ton, and I find I'm never hurting for melees with this setup. And that is basically it for the build. This build is incredibly powerful and so much fun to play with. I've absolutely fallen in love with it, and I can't wait to take it through the birthplace of the Vile GM, as it will be perfect in that Nightfall. Anyways, that's it. Leave a like and be sure to subscribe, as it really helps the video, and I want everyone to see the incredible power of this build. And if you're still here, then thanks so much for watching to the end. It means a lot. I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.